The Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, joins me now, fresh from the Chamber. Congratulations on your speech.
Thanks,
and
Sarah.
welcome back to 7:30.
Thank you.
I want to start with immigration. Sky called it massive. What you have announced is a 25% cut to Australia's migration intake. Where in the system will those cuts be?
Well, there are a number of parts, obviously, that make up the problem that the government's created at the moment. It's obviously been a huge influx of international students. The numbers have gone up in the programs otherwise, including the refugee and humanitarian program, as well as the permanent migration program. So our proposal is to reduce each of those and to make sure that we can release housing stock, existing houses that are there already, for which there is huge demand from Australians either to rent or to purchase, and to put Australians first in terms of home ownership, and that's a very key part of the speech.
Australia first doesn't sound like a very Australian type thing to say.
Well, there are countless families I've spoken to as I've gone around the country.
I think it's the tone I'm talking about.
Well, of every nationality, of people who have just arrived, people who are second, third generation from India or China. They can't find a house for their child who's in the workforce, working hard, paying taxes, but cannot for love nor money buy a house.
No question, we've got a housing shortage.
So it's for all of those Australians
Yes.
Who want to find a house.
Let me just go back to the question. So whereabouts in the system are those cuts in those numbers going to come from?
Well again, so to the permanent program, we reduced that to...
Yes, I beg your pardon. So within that program, are we going to see a cut to the skills program?
Well, we've said that we want to prioritise skills, particularly those with skills who can help build houses and help in the construction sector, because we have an 11-year low in building approvals at the moment, and the homes the Prime Minister's promising just aren't going to be built. And anybody knows at the moment, I mean, it's near impossible to get a builder or a carpenter or an electrician to build a new house or to do a renovation.
So
critical, so we need to be realistic about that.
In that critical skills area, to be clear, there's not going to be any cuts to migration of people doing critical skills visas.
There are a couple of points here, and I understand the point you're getting to. One is...
I mean, to underline it for the audience's sake, obviously we know there are huge, I think it's 48% of professional occupations showing skill shortages. So I want to be very clear about that. Yeah. Will there be any cuts to that part of the program? Well,
there'll be a cut to the overall program, and the mix we've had always in government and that we've held to in opposition is that you want about a 2/3, 1/3 split. That's how it was in the Howard years, in the Rudd-Gillard years, and since then, and that's what we would continue to go on.
That does mean cutting some people's opportunities to come here in the critical skills section.
It means that we can take a decision to bring more people in, which the Prime Minister's done in the last 2 years, almost 1 million people, when only 265,000 homes are built. So we can pretend that the housing can appear overnight, but it can't.
But this is a question about a critical skill shortage that exists in Australia. As I said, 48% of professional occupations in national shortage. I just want to be absolutely clear whether or not in those categories, nurses, doctors, cybersecurity experts, for example, we're not going to see further shortages.
We prioritise the skills list. I mean, that's an important observation. But I guess the point that I was building to otherwise is that we want to make sure that those people who may have recently retired, who won't come back into the workforce on a part-time basis because it affects their pension with the taper rate, that we've allowed in our announcement tonight for more of those people to come back in. Now, we have 15 million people in Australia of working age with many and varied skills, and many who want to come back into the workforce part-time. If it's beyond the wit of big business in this country to train them up or to provide opportunity for them to fill some of those skills that you're talking about, then I think we've got bigger problems than we realise. So the onus
but we're talking about people overseas. We're talking about, I understand that that's a training question. That's a question about training, but obviously there's a lag. In this case, we're talking about industries that need a trained workforce right now.
But I mean, listen to the point you're making, which doesn't make any sense. You've got nurses who have just retired. You've got people in the trades.
But you were talking about training.
You're talking about trades. No, I was talking about people who had retired and people who are veterans and allowing them to work more. These are people with the requisite skills who can come back into the workforce but refuse to now because they ultimately lose their pension, their healthcare card, etc. So we liberate that workforce. And those people obviously already have, in most cases, the vast majority of cases, existing housing arrangements. So That makes sense. But in the end, you have to make tough decisions, you're right.
Yes.
And my decision is to prioritise Australians for housing in our country because we've got people living in tents, we've got people living in cars. I want to see them in housing.
No question that there is a housing crisis in this country. Let me just talk briefly to you about international students because you are talking about restricting those numbers. Now, we know that international students pay for a very large percentage of university research. Will you commit now, if you're going to cap their numbers, to replacing that funding in full?
Well, let's look at University of Sydney, for example. They made $1.4 billion last year out of international students, last year alone. 47% of their students on campus are international students, and it's untenable. And the other universities, frankly, have been critical, at least in private, of Sydney.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that the NAB last year said that international students also accounted for more than half of all of Australia's economic growth. They're a very important cohort for Australian growth and productivity, aren't they?
Well, they're a part of it, but we need to house them. And you can't bring in a million people.
I think only 4%
houses.
of international students actually are in the rental market.
Really? Where are they living, Sarah?
I'm not an expert in, housing, but I'm
I'll tell you where
quoting figures
they're
from
living in
the
rental accommodation,
bodies that run.
which is evidenced by the fact that people are 40 and 50 deep at the moment lining up for a rental property that they can't get into. 49 people miss out in that equation.
So when the Real Estate
I
Institute
want to
quotes
make
those
sure,
figures, are they wrong that only 4% of international students are in the private rental market?
Well, I just say to you, why do we have a housing crisis in this country?
For many complex reasons, mostly to do with supply. But let's just stay with this issue for a moment. I just want to go back to the question that I asked you.
No, I actually just want to pick you up on that point because you're in error. The government has brought in 928,000 people in 2 years. There are 265,000 homes that have been built in that period. Do you think there's a mismatch? Of course there is. So we can't pretend that there's not. I don't have any problem.
I'm merely pointing out the obvious that we know that this is a question of supply.
But the statement you make is factually incorrect. And all I'd say is that do we want international students? Fantastic, that's great, and they can contribute to the economy, but we need to have the planning in place before you bring people in, because otherwise they displace Australians from housing, which is exactly what's happened.
Now, what you're proposing here, the program will increase again after a 1 year cut to it. So I just want to acknowledge that.
2 years.
2 year, I beg your pardon. I'm just getting over the facts now. But thank you for the correction. Now, this, of course, isn't just about skills, and it's not just about international students, although those things are both very important. Long term, we are an ageing population. We need young migrants to fill the gap, to pay the taxes, to provide the services into as the population ages. Isn't there a danger here, if you look to migration to solve the problems, that we end up with a less productive economy, a smaller economy?
Well, we have a less productive economy if we've got people sleeping in tents and in cars. And homelessness is at a record high under this government. Young Australians have lost the dream of home ownership, and I intend to restore it. We've got pensioners who can't find rental accommodation, and that is not an acceptable situation morally, socially or economically for our country, and it's not one that I would abide as Prime Minister. Yes, we want to see a balanced migration program, but this government has ramped it up way beyond where Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard had their programs. It has been unmanaged. Each prediction the government's made in my EFO or in budgets where they say that the migration numbers or the net overseas migration figure will come down, it always goes up. And so you need to plan, and it's not just housing. People know that if you move suburbs, it's hard to get your kids into school or into childcare. It's hard to get into a GP because the doctors have closed their books. It's hard to get elective surgery. These factors have all contributed to capacity constraints because of the lack of planning in the migration program. And there's no sense in denying that because that's just the lived reality of Australians every day.
Let's move on to some of the other points that you were making this evening. And one of them, crucially, is about spending and has been about spending for some time. You are critical of the government's budget and the amount of money that it adds to spending next year. Will you now detail what specific cuts you're going to do to rein in government spending? Well,
$13.7 billion is a good starting point, and that is money that's going to green hydrogen product producers and to billionaires and mining projects otherwise.
Well, let's just, since you've raised that, let's stay with Future in Australia, because what you've gone to is the centrepiece of the government's Future Made in Australia, and in particular the production credits for Australian businesses. Now, we're in a world of global competition, as you know, in these new industries. Why do you oppose these tax breaks that could help Australian businesses in this era of very sharp global competition?
Because I'm not into wasting taxpayers' money.
Why
I'm
is it a
into
waste?
making sure that people who work hard for their money can believe and have faith in a government that they're not going to waste it. And I think you can have a look at the government's decision in relation to solar panels.
But I'm asking you, why don't we say...
No, this is all part of the same package.
Yeah, but I want to ask you about the production tax credits, because this is the centrepiece of the government's policy.
The centrepiece
That's what we're talking about.
No, it's not actually. The centrepiece of their measure, which they announced as a pre-budget announcement, was in relation to solar panels and quantum computing.
But I'm asking,
it's all part of the same
I understand,
spend.
but I'm asking you specifically, and I think it's fair enough. You've come here as the Leader of the Opposition. You're presenting yourself as the alternative Prime Minister. Yes. You are saying that you will not support these production tax credits for these new industries. And I'm asking, because of the enormous amount of money that's being made available in competitive countries, in competitive industries, why won't you help Australian businesses be competitive? Well,
a couple of points. One is that Australian business is not going to be competitive in the production of solar panels against China.
I think these production tax credits relate to critical minerals and green hydrogen.
When you say that you've asked me, when you say that you've asked me to come here
to answer that question
and answer
first.
The questions, that's the opportunity that you've offered me, and I'm very happy to take it up.
And you've pivoted to solar panels.
I just need to be able to finish a sentence.
Yes, let's go back to production credits.
Where are they spending money? On solar panels. It's not going to work, and it will be a waste of taxpayers' money. I'd love to think it's going to work. It's not. I'd love to think that there's not demand for different products or that others might out in the economy. The government can conjure up all sorts of different arguments and figures. We've just got to deal with the reality. The reality is at the moment there's huge demand for our critical minerals. The reality at the moment is that there is huge demand for our mining product, and if that demand is there is an enormous amount of capital that's available to support those startup projects.
And those projects are receiving huge amounts of money from, for example, the United States Inflation Reduction Act, which is what is making our own mining companies potentially not competitive.
Just to finish the sentence, though. So if there's demand for those products, that is, there's an order book that at the moment...
well, the order book doesn't exist yet because these are production credits for
it does actually.
Production that will get to scale.
But again, Sarah, please, if we could just stick with the facts, there's enormous demand and order books for all sorts of critical minerals at the moment. The demand exists, which is why these projects want to get off the ground. Now, there's an enormous amount of capital out there in super funds, in individuals, in institutions who are investing into companies.
Well, let me ask you this question. West Australian. Here's a question. I don't want to run out of time on this because you've got the Leader of the West Australian Liberals supports the tax credits. She says she said that today. Have you asked her to stop undermining your argument?
So I'll just finish the sentence that I was trying to finish before. There's an enormous amount of capital out there for these projects. Why would you put at risk taxpayers' money into these projects when the private sector is prepared to fund them? That is a fundamental question to ask. Now, I want to see WA boom, and under my government, they will. I'm not going to go forward with the nature positive, which is really the mining negative bill that Tanya Plibersek has shelved for the time being because the West Australian Premier monstered the Labor government here and they retreated. That would be a disaster for mining in WA. It would see it come to a halt. That will not happen under a government I lead. We will not have in place all the regulation and the burdens that take tens of years for mines to be developed, because if we get mining right and we can meet this insatiable demand for our critical minerals, we can grow the WA economy and therefore the Australian economy. We can see roads and the GPs and the NDIS, the other services funded. We can put money into defence, which is required. At the moment, the government is talking out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to the mining sector. That's not something we will...
Let's go back to spending, because that's where we were before we went on to the future made in Australia. I was asking you what specific cuts that you are proposing to make to reverse the spending, the government spending of which you're so critical.
Sure.
It's time for some detail. What are you prepared to cut?
Well, I was about to go there, and I think you cut me off again before, but let me finish it. The government's employed 36,000 more public servants in Canberra at a cost of $24 billion over 4 years. The entire Defence Force is made up of 58,000 men and women.
I think I just want to interrupt to say this. You're talking about, well, I think it's important. This is not a matter of interruption, it's a matter of staying on topic.
Right.
What we're talking about is you wanting to reverse this year's surplus goes into deficit next year. We're talking about $37 billion. Public servants aren't going to fix that. So I'm asking which parts of government spending, substantial cuts to government spending, because you're also talking about adding the top end of the stage 3 tax cuts back. These are large sums of money, $39 billion for that. What are you going to do to provide the money that's going to reverse this deficit of which you are so critical?
Sarah, the $13.7 billion and the $24 billion that I've just identified, almost $40 billion. Which opposition leader has come in here and detailed $40 billion worth of spending cuts? None ever. And this government has spent $315 billion more than what we had budgeted when we were in government. It means that the average family now is paying a much higher interest rate. It means that people can't get into houses because of their decisions that they've made in the budget. And I want to turn that around. I want to make sure that we can get our country back on track. And you've got a government at the moment that is prioritising public servants in Canberra above our Defence Force, above support for pensioners, above people who are living homelessly, above people who can't get into see a GP. I want to listen to and act on the advice of the Australian people. That's what I've detailed tonight. We'll do it in a responsible, not reckless way, and we can provide a much greater vision and future for our country if we do that.
Peter Dutton, thank you very much indeed for coming up
Great
straight
pleasure,
after the
Sarah.
speech. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.